Previously on Patrick H. Willems.
How was your vacation?
I don't want to talk about it.
The coconut?
This is Charles.
Charles?
I felt like we needed some new supporting cast members. I awoke to a text message from my parents. Its words were simple and direct. "We are going on vacation. Please come up and house sit while we're gone. Feel free to eat any food in the fridge." I booked a train ticket and made the trip upstate. I arrived at the house on a Sunday. A snowstorm had hit the night before. So on this cold winter night, the frigid wind blowing against the windows, I decided to do what anyone would do. Finally sit down and watch the 2018 Robert Zemeckis film, Welcome to Marwen.
These are the women of Marwen.
But you have to love the pain, Hogan.
You just don't get it, do you? Women are the saviors of the world!
As the credits rolled, two questions emerged from my mouth.
What was that? And how did that happen?
That night, as I lay in the old bed in my childhood bedroom, struggling to sleep, my mind raced. Robert Zemeckis has made so many movies that I love. Movies that are deeply moving and truly hilarious, with visuals that pioneered new filmmaking techniques. And watching Marwen, it seems like something happened to that great filmmaker along the way. So I'm going to figure out what happened, and the only way to do that is to revisit his entire filmography from the very beginning. I'm writing you these letters so I can feel like I'm not on this journey alone. From the very beginning, Robert Zemeckis would begin nearly every movie the same way, with a complex tracking shot that establishes key information. In I Wanna Hold Your Hand, the shot introduces the time period and setting of the climax. In Used Cars, it's the central character, location, and premise. In Forrest Gump, it's a visual metaphor for a main theme of the movie. And in Back to the Future, the opening shot is so complex it sets up pretty much the entire movie. Right from the start, Zemeckis was obsessed with efficient, intricate storytelling. The first period of his career is probably my favorite. It's defined primarily by his collaboration with writer Bob Gale, with whom Zemeckis wrote I Wanna Hold Your Hand, Used Cars, the Back to the Future trilogy, as well as the infamous Steven Spielberg-directed flop, 1941. Even before he got his hands on cutting-edge visual effects technology, Zemeckis was always a technician. Each of these screenplays told stories with clockwork precision, full of complex moving parts that clicked together perfectly. Each character has a clear arc. Every setup returns to pay off in the end. If a wacky side character shows up for one scene, they'll end up serving a greater purpose in the third act. The climactic sequences in all of these movies are like Zemeckis and Gale knocking down dominoes, just payoff after payoff. They feel like proto-versions of Edgar Wright movies. These airtight Swiss watch comedies where, when you watch them again, you realize the entire third act was set up in the first 10 minutes.
Anyway, your grandpa hit him with the car and brought him into the house. So you decided to go with him to the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. It was the night of that terrible thunderstorm, remember, George? Your father kissed me for the very first time on that dance floor.
Let's take his very first movie, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, which has 6 central characters who are all trying to see the Beatles on the night of their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Each character has their own goal. Pam wants one last night of fun before she gets married the following day. Grace wants a photo of the band to launch her journalism career. Larry wants to impress Grace. Janice wants to protest the Beatles. Tony wants to end their careers. And Rosie is a fanatic who just wants to see her beloved Paul McCartney. The film breaks off into multiple storylines following each of the characters as they experience their own dramatic arcs, before they reconvene at the climax to watch the legendary Beatles performance. Years before Zemeckis was creating scenes where Tom Hanks spoke to John Lennon and shook hands with Richard Nixon, he created a similar magic trick on a much smaller budget, using a mix of archival TV footage, body doubles, and clever camera angles to add fictional characters to an historic TV event. But I don't want to make it seem like these are cold, clinical films more concerned with intricately constructed plots than the characters at the center of them. When I think of the humanity in these movies, I immediately think of Nancy Allen in the climactic scene of I Want to Hold Your Hand. She's just blown up her life by ditching her fiancé and bailing on her impending marriage, and as she watches the Beatles, who represent the joy and possibility of youth, she breaks down in tears. It's a really wonderful moment. Zemeckis always seemed to do his best work when he had a protagonist with an extremely clear goal they spend the whole film pursuing. Whether it's these teens trying to see the Beatles, or Kurt Russell trying to raise enough money through a janky used car dealership to launch a political career, or Marty McFly just trying to get back to 1985, each of these goals requires an elaborate, well-timed technical plan. That's not much different from what making a movie is. And Zemeckis being an obsessive technician, he probably connects more to these kinds of protagonists. This is what Zemeckis' less successful films are missing. I think 1941 is more fun than its reputation. Spielberg is a good director, but it's missing that core human element, that singular desire and goal that propelled his other films. Without that, 1941 is all manic clockwork plot, impressively constructed but soulless. Back to the Future Part 2 is lots of fun to watch, but the reason it doesn't linger with us and resonate like the first one is that Marty has no real drive or desire. He's just scrambling, trying to get out of each new scenario he finds himself in. If the first movie is about understanding your parents as human beings, Part 2 is about the dangers of time machines falling into the wrong hands? The first major turning point for Zemeckis as a filmmaker was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the 1988 live-action animation hybrid that stars Bob Hoskins alongside a massive cast of hand-drawn animated characters. This movie is 32 years old, and still today it's a staggering achievement. I watch every shot of this movie with my mouth hanging open in astonishment, wondering how the hell they pulled this off. Nearly every shot requires an unreal amount of choreography. The human actors need to hit their marks perfectly and maintain the correct eye lines when interacting with characters who aren't there. The puppeteers need to operate the inanimate objects the toons are interacting with. The animation is twice as difficult as a regular cartoon would be because the characters need to fit within a three-dimensional world with a moving camera, and have shadows hand-drawn on them so it feels like they exist within the same space. While Zemeckis' earlier movies were storytelling magic tricks, this was the first technical magic trick, a movie that truly showed audiences impossible things they had never seen before. And that's something he would keep doing with each new movie. This was the first time he really got his hands on some cool new toys. For his next movie, Back to the Future Part 2, he demanded that they have multiple Michael J. Foxes or Tom Wilsons interacting with each other, and a story that takes place partly within the margins of the original film, which required inventing motion control camera dollies. Now Zemeckis wasn't just a director who made fun comedies. Now he was a pioneer who revolutionized cinema, and he would never look back again. I woke up and saw the temperature had dropped below zero. I went outside and brought in enough firewood to last the next couple days, and did my best to warm up the house. It's lonely here. The house is surrounded by woods on all sides. I haven't seen a person in days. The solitude does give me more time to think about Zemeckis though, especially his 90s period. Look, it happens to a lot of directors known for comedies or blockbuster family entertainment. Eventually, they want to be taken seriously. Sometimes you get the good version, like Spielberg with Schindler's List or Empire of the Sun. And sometimes you get Green Book or Joker. So in the early 90s, Robert Zemeckis turned 40 years old, switched his cinematographer from Dean Cundey to Don Burgess, and pivoted to the next phase of his career. Adult Dramas, Part 1. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about the film Forrest Gump, and I need to get them out here. I am really profoundly confused by this movie. I shouldn't be. It was the biggest movie of 1994, it won a whole bunch of Oscars including Best Picture and Director for Zemeckis. It's one of the most popular movies ever made. What could possibly be confusing about it? Well, I honestly have no idea what the movie is trying to say. About half of it plays like a satire. The way Forrest constantly encounters real figures like celebrities or politicians who were assassinated or died horrible deaths often seems darkly satirical, especially how the film will suddenly cut to disturbing actual news footage of them being shot, while Forrest charmingly talks about how some people just didn't like them very much. But then much of the film, especially the whole relationship with Jenny, is played totally sincerely. It's classic sentimental Hollywood storytelling. But also, consider this. Forrest Gump as a character does nothing but blindly follow orders and do whatever anyone tells him to do, and he becomes an enormous success. He's a star athlete in multiple sports. He meets multiple presidents. He's a war hero. He becomes astoundingly wealthy. On the other hand, Jenny is independent and constantly rebels against unjust systems. She just wants to escape from the cycle of abuse that she seems to be stuck in. And in return, she encounters more abuse, gets kicked out of college, becomes a drug addict, gets AIDS, and finally dies. What are we supposed to take from that? Watching the movie again, I had an epiphany. Forrest Gump is the Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons, but played straight.
And the guy standing next to me is President Gerald Ford. And this is when I was on tour with the Smashing Pumpkins. Oh, and here's a picture of me in outer space.
You went into outer space. You.
Sure. You've never been? Would you like to see my Grammy Award?
Lieutenant Dan is Frank Grimes, infuriated by how Forrest, like Homer Simpson, blindly stumbles into fame and success through sheer luck. The point of that Simpsons episode is to self-reflexively comment on the show itself and the bizarre reality it had built. But in Forrest Gump, I don't really know what the point is. This isn't something like Paddington, where the central character is so good and kind and pure that he changes everyone around him for the better. Forrest Gump is a good person, but he succeeds and has a great life while everyone around him suffers and dies. I don't get it. Also, a whole video could be made about how 15 years later, Eric Roth, who wrote Forrest Gump, used a very similar format and structure for The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, to very different effect. But that's not what this video is about. Anyway, let's move on. I'm not sure how big a role this played in Zemeckis choosing this project, but once again, Forrest Gump provided an opportunity to use fancy new toys to pull off several cinematic magic tricks. They might not seem like much now, but in '94, inserting Tom Hanks into old TV footage, meeting various celebrities and world leaders, was mind-blowing, as was removing Gary Sinise's legs. This is relatively subtle compared to Roger Rabbit, but it was becoming standard for audiences going into Zemeckis movies to expect to see something they had never seen before. Now here's what I find interesting. After Forrest Gump, Zemeckis had all the power in the world. He had won Oscars and made some of the most popular movies of all time. He could do anything. And he made Contact. I mentioned in the last section that Zemeckis' best movies are driven by protagonists obsessed with pursuing singular goals, and that holds true in this era. In Contact, Jodie Foster's character is a scientist who devotes her entire life to proving that there is life elsewhere in the universe. Basically to making contact. And you can sense that Zemeckis relates to this obsession and this commitment to a singular pursuit, and it gives the movie a focus that I don't think Forrest Gump has. And what's amazing is that while Zemeckis has all the toys in the world at his disposal here, he shows surprising restraint. Yes, the film opens with a 4-minute long, entirely CGI shot, but it's one that's extremely relevant to the story and themes of the movie, as well as being scientifically accurate. Mostly, he uses visual effects to create a greater sense of immersion, like this shot that moves from outside the house through a window into Ellie's bedroom, or of course the famous mirror tracking shot which still breaks my brain every time I look at it. I still don't entirely get how it was done. Mostly though, the toys are invisible. There are special camera rigs that allow for more complex blocking with longer takes. The climactic wormhole sequence is shot pretty matter-of-factly. There's a real maturity to the filmmaking. I would say a lot of the same stuff about Castaway. Once again, there's the protagonist with the singular goal. And something I've noticed about these goals is that they're almost always some form of escape. Chuck wants to escape from the island. Marty wants to escape from 1955. Ellie wants to reach beyond the world she knows. Rudy wants to move on to a career in politics. And the kids in I Wanna Hold Your Hand just want to experience something exciting and profound. When Zemeckis is making movies about ambition and escape, and following someone's obsessive technical process of getting there, that's when he does his best work. Castaway is so compelling because Zemeckis seems so interested in just watching Chuck Noland learn to survive. The great magic trick of that movie isn't a visual effect at all. It's Tom Hanks losing 60 pounds between scenes when the story jumps ahead 4 years. I have a theory that shooting Castaway is where a switch flipped in Zemeckis' brain. To pull off this cinematic magic trick in which the lead actor transformed so significantly, there was this pesky human element that had to be waited on and worked around. They had to shut down production for a full year just to pull this off. The real world and human beings slowed them down. And Zemeckis made sure he would never have to deal with that again. With Zemeckis, it always comes back to toys. Each new movie brought new toys and new opportunities to play with them. I've made a Robert Zemeckis toy. I've started talking to it, trying to understand him. In the early 2000s, it's like he isolated himself on an island. Just him and his toys. He didn't need anyone else. It's so cold out here. I think I'm staying outside because I'm putting off watching the next few movies. I'm just not excited about 6 hours of creepy doll people. Okay, fine. Let's get this over with. Last fall, Martin Scorsese caused a great stir when he said Marvel superhero movies were more like theme park rides than cinema. I think he was a little bit off base, because if you're looking for movies that are more like theme park rides, a way better pick is Robert Zemeckis' motion capture 3D movies. The Polar Express, in particular, with its nameless characters and countless sequences that are basically roller coaster simulations, feels like a Universal Studios ride expanded to feature length. Of course, what really matters, especially in the context of Zemeckis' career, is less the movie itself and more how it was made. The Polar Express was the first fully motion capture animated movie. The cast, which was basically just Tom Hanks in most of the roles, performed all the parts in a small warehouse wearing mocap suits, and then the film was entirely animated within computers. Here, Zemeckis finally figured out a way to remove any real-world or human problems, difficulties, or complications from the filmmaking process. The camera could go anywhere and do anything. Every shot cost the same amount of money. It didn't matter what the actors looked like or how much weight he wanted them to gain or lose, he could do anything. He had all the toys in the world. But we can't talk about the Polar Express without talking about
the uncanny valley.
Let me show you something. Check out this chart.
You see, as artificial representations of humans become more and more realistic, they reach a point where they stop being endearing and become creepy.
Tell it to me in Star Wars.
All right, we like R2-D2 and C-3PO.
They're nice.
And up here, we have a real person, like Han Solo.
He acts like he doesn't care, but he does.
But down here, we have a CGI stormtrooper or Tom Hanks in the Polar Express.
I'm scared. Get me out of there.
When people think of Zemeckis mocap movies, they think of the uncanny valley and the creepy humans with their dead eyes. Now obviously, when the Polar Express was made, motion capture technology was in its infancy, and in particular, the facial performance capture was not as detailed or advanced as it is now. And I realized that Zemeckis wanted to replicate the look of Chris Van Allsburg's illustrations, but that still doesn't excuse the choice to make the humans look as realistic as possible, and thus highlight the stiffness of the animation and limitations of the technology. Part of why Gollum in Lord of the Rings worked 2 years before this was that he had exaggerated facial features and thus looked less human. In 2006, the mocap movie Monster House, which Zemeckis produced, used much cartoonier character models that kept them out of the uncanny valley. What I'm saying is, Zemeckis could have avoided this. Now, I don't want to dismiss the massive technical breakthrough that the Polar Express was. It pioneered new filmmaking tools and techniques. Zemeckis walked so people like James Cameron could run. And in many parts of the movie, you can see his imagination truly being set free. Now he could construct a whole shot following a paper ticket that's like the feather shot in Forrest Gump if it snorted a whole bunch of coke. Okay, I want to talk about Beowulf.
I am Beowulf!
Because remember when Robert Zemeckis directed a Beowulf movie written by Neil Gaiman? That was a real thing that happened that somehow we as a society just forgot about. This is probably the most baffling entry in Zemeckis' entire filmography. It's a dark, violent fantasy epic that has nothing in common with anything else he's ever made. Zemeckis has barely spoken about this movie. He did a single interview that is no longer available anywhere online. Trust me, I tried to find it. My guess as to why he made it is that he wanted to prove mocap movies didn't just have to be overblown theme park rides for kids. They could be mature and adult. And I will give him props for making one of the very few American animated movies aimed at older audiences. And here's the thing. If it weren't for the look of the movie, Beowulf would be pretty great. The script by Gaiman and Roger Avary is really smart and exciting. The cast is amazing. But once again, Zemeckis is aiming for this photorealistic animation style that detracts from nearly every moment in the whole thing. I can't look at a scene like this, between rubbery animated Anthony Hopkins, rubbery animated John Malkovich, and rubbery animated Robin Wright, and not constantly think about how I wish I was watching the real actors instead. Angelina Jolie shows up, giving a killer performance as Grendel's mother, but we're watching this weird, naked Angelina Jolie doll. It feels like a waste. All this talent and potential spent on something that will never look like more than a PlayStation 4 cutscene. 2 years later, Zemeckis made his third and final all-mocap movie, a new version of A Christmas Carol for Disney, with Jim Carrey playing like half the parts. The script, Zemeckis' only solo screenwriting credit, is actually a pretty solid adaptation. But I can't stop asking, why? At this point in his career, is Robert Zemeckis making this? The only thing that makes sense to me is that after the extremely mixed reception to his previous two mocap efforts, the only way he could make another was by doing a big Disney family Christmas movie. I mean, you gotta give the guy credit for committing really hard to this one thing, despite so many people being turned off by it. This is truly one of the strangest eras a major director has ever had. Remember in the 90s when Garth Brooks, at the peak of his popularity, released an album as a fictional rock star named Chris Gaines? This is like if Brooks had then spent the next decade only releasing music as Chris Gaines, not giving a shit what any of his fans thought.
I hope you're getting these letters. I haven't spoken to a human being all week, and I may be losing my grasp on reality. This morning I got up and looked out the window and started thinking about how nearly every drama Zemeckis has made is about a person who becomes some kind of media figure. There are so many news reports and press conferences in these movies. Forrest Gump, Contact, Castaway, Flight, The Walk, Welcome to Marwen. What is it? Does Zemeckis just love watching the news? I keep asking him, but he never answers. He just sits silently. And then I remember that he's a doll.
I had fun making that movie because I had a lot of toys.
And then Zemeckis' mocap period ended. Maybe he wanted something different. Maybe the studios realized audiences weren't crazy about those creepy-looking movies and that they weren't worth the $200 million price tags. Either way, he returned to traditional live-action filmmaking and spent another strange decade, this time making dramas for adults. With these movies, it's harder to pinpoint exactly what drew Zemeckis to each one. This was no longer the 90s, a time when he was at the height of his commercial powers, when he could make a 2.5-hour movie about Tom Hanks being lonely and it would become a blockbuster smash. In 2012, he made Flight, the first R-rated movie he'd made in 32 years. Other than the spectacular plane crash sequence in the first act, there are no obvious toys here for him to play with, no magic tricks to play on the audience. It feels like a movie he made to prove he still had it, and could still make something adults would watch. My mixed feelings about the script aside, Zemeckis can still direct the hell out of a movie. If only he'd learned to stop using the most obvious, deeply lame needle drops imaginable. We don't need Sympathy for the Devil twice in one movie. We don't need Under the Bridge to play over a scene where someone is about to shoot up heroin. Seriously, I feel like Zemeckis' entire music library is just like 10 greatest hits compilation CDs. Anyway, moving on. The Walk is a weird movie. The early stretches of it are kinda rough. Zemeckis is going all in with his toys, throwing visual tricks at the audience from the opening shot. But this is now 2015, and we're used to constantly seeing impossible CGI visuals. Instead of breathtaking like his tricks used to be, now they feel like the exhausting theme park attractions of his mocap movies. Plus, Joseph Gordon-Levitt is wearing a very dumb wig, playing a very quirky guy with a very French accent, and it's a lot.
I said it once, so maybe 3 times just now, but watch, I will not say it again.
But after the first act, Zemeckis finds what he's been missing for the past 15 years. That central human force that drove his greatest movies. A protagonist pursuing one clear goal. And once the movie focuses on the mission to break into the World Trade Center, it essentially turns into a heist movie, and finds the energy and purpose that Zemeckis had been missing. And when it finally culminates in the titular Walk, he uses his toys for good instead of evil, and it's honestly pretty damn good. As for Allied, the World War II drama with Brad Pitt and Marion Cotillard, I don't know, man. I don't get this one. It's Zemeckis' most blatant attempt to ape another style of movie, here in 1940s war dramas, though not to as extreme an extent as Soderbergh did with The Good German. And Zemeckis puts his toys to work with some heavily CGI'd locations and Brad Pitt's digitally smoothed face, but I don't see much of Bobby Z in this one. And now, finally, it's time to welcome you to Marwen.
Well, here it is. Beautiful downtown Marwen.
Watching Welcome to Marwen, I keep thinking about Peter Jackson's 2009 adaptation of The Lovely Bones. With the Lord of the Rings trilogy and then King Kong, Jackson had spent so long immersed in massively budgeted VFX-filled films, it's like he forgot how he used to make movies before them. So when he took on The Lovely Bones, a small, dark, intimate story, he turned it into a $65 million visual effects extravaganza. He didn't know any other way of working. If you watch Marwen Call, the documentary that inspired Welcome to Marwen, you'll see an odd, melancholy story about a man trying to get by after suffering a severe trauma by creating an unusual storytelling project. It's a quiet movie, it doesn't have easy answers. The biggest plot development is when Mark Hogenkamp, the main guy, attends a gallery show of his photography. It is not an adventure movie where, by defeating an evil Nazi witch in a time machine, Mark can instantly fix his PTSD and painkiller addiction.
In the name of Marwen, I vanquish you!
Because that's what Welcome to Marwen is. Like Peter Jackson before him, Zemeckis seems unable to see any way to tell a story that doesn't involve his collection of digital toys. Since the quiet, complicated character study that this should be doesn't fit with how he makes movies, he mutated it into something else. A bombastic, inspirational adventure that ends with an implied future romance for the hero. And if I haven't already mentioned, half of this movie is an animated mocap movie. He still found a way to do it. Look, I don't really care about the facts and whether or not this is faithful to the true story. What I do care about is that this seems like a dramatically oversimplified, tonally confusing, maybe even irresponsible way to tell this story. Like, there's a scene where a Nazi doll comes to life and starts murdering real people in a courthouse. Why is that in there? Look, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Zemeckis and say he sees himself as Mark Hogenkamp. I don't think that's the case. I do think there's something fascinating about a filmmaker who became more and more obsessed with filmmaking toys, finally making a movie about a man who can only express himself through toys, and that movie leans so heavily on those filmmaking toys for the animated sequences starring toys. It feels like this is where Robert Zemeckis was destined to end up. I don't know where there is for him to go from here. Zemeckis feels out of step with the current landscape of Hollywood. He dominated the 80s, the period of optimistic pop blockbusters. He dominated the 90s, when people flocked to lavish movie star-driven dramas. And then, when he spent years in the mocap wilderness, it's like he lost a full decade of artistic evolution. This is when his mentor, Steven Spielberg, was making his most experimental films, exploring murky moral shades of gray with Minority Report or Munich. And in this period, most of Zemeckis' former peers fell from relevance. Brian De Palma, Richard Donner, John Landis, John McTiernan, Cameron Crowe, Chris Columbus, all of them eventually fell out of favor with audiences and critics. It is very hard to maintain a thriving Hollywood directing career for multiple decades. I think the best point of comparison might be George Miller. Like Zemeckis, he spent over a decade making weird CGI animated kids movies. People wrote him off, and then he finally made what might be his greatest film by doing what Zemeckis has always refused to do, returning to exactly where he started. But Robert Zemeckis never wants to look back. You'll have to pry those toys from his cold, dead hands.
A letter arrived at the house today with no return address. It contained a press clipping. The headline read, "Robert Zemeckis closes deal to direct and co-write Disney's live-action Pinocchio." Here it was, the moment it feels Zemeckis' whole career had been building to. He spent decades becoming more and more obsessed with toys, and now he's going to remake the most famous movie about a toy. This will not be his last movie. There's always a chance he will return and make something that feels human again. But this feels like the end of the story, the inevitable conclusion we always should have known was coming. It's the bittersweet point so many filmmakers must reach, to direct a Disney live-action remake. But now I can close the book on this chapter of my life and move on from Robert Zemeckis. I can leave this cold house and return home. How is New York these days? Has it changed in my absence? I can ask you these questions in person soon. All the best, Patrick.
Another letter for the coconut. I still haven't gotten my blood test results back.
There's been a letter every single day. I don't know if this is like an extended Andy Kaufman style bit or what, but he's being so weird. I've never...
Matt, maybe something happened to Pat while he was on that vacation. Maybe he experienced some sort of trauma and his brain got all messed up. And to cope with it, he had to create an imaginary friend for himself. Someone who could never hurt him. Similar to the 1998 inspirational Steve Carell vehicle, Welcome to Marwin.
I'm just gonna open the letters.
Matt, don't open his mail! Because opening and tampering with someone else's mail is a federal crime and punishable by up to 5 years in prison, along with a $250,000 fine.
Guys, I'm back. Jesus, turn on the lights. Hey, Charles. So I get asked the same two questions a lot. When are you going to make some kind of project that's not a video essay? And whatever happened to that short film you started shooting 2 years ago? Well, I have good news. That short film from a couple years ago, we're reworking it and revamping it and reshooting it from scratch with a bigger budget and more resources. It is the biggest project that I've worked on in years, and it's going to premiere this spring exclusively on Nebula, a streaming platform I helped develop along with, I'm willing to bet, a bunch of your favorite YouTube creators. Nebula is a place where you can watch all of our videos ad-free, but where we're also experimenting with different kinds of projects outside the stuff we usually do on YouTube. Since here, we don't have to deal with the dreaded algorithm. So it's a place where I can make a whole short film. Or there's the anthology series, Working Titles, all about the greatest TV title sequences with episodes by people like me, or Polyphonic, Just Right, Nando V Movie, Cinema Wins, and a ton more really talented people. Now here is the cool part. CuriosityStream, the great documentary streaming service that's one of our regular sponsors, has partnered with Nebula. So if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link in the description, you get Nebula for free. This way, you're supporting independent creators like me, you get Curiosity Stream and their huge selection of great documentaries, plus you'll be able to see my movie when it premieres. We're all working really, really hard on it, and it's going to be great. Right, Jake?
Yeah.
Hello everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm all stuffed up because I have been treating myself poorly and not sleeping enough trying to get it done, but now it's finally finished. A few thank yous. I want to thank Ethan Alter for giving me the idea for this video a year ago and then finally giving me the Blu-ray of Welcome to Marwen, so I had no choice. I finally had to make it. I want to thank Griffin Newman for being the toy consultant on this video and helping me find the right Robert Zemeckis doll. Other important stuff, if you want to support this channel, help us keep making these videos, and get access to exclusive stuff like live stream Q&As, our Discord server, early announcements about the videos, then join us over at the Patreon. If you want to get Space Wizards t-shirts and cool mugs like this, they're all available in our merch store. There's a link in the description. Of course, I hope you're listening to at least one of my two podcasts, the Infinity Podcast and Can't Get Enough of Keanu. New episodes drop every week. You can talk about all of this stuff in the videos and the podcast and everything in our subreddit, r/Thrillums, and I think that's all for now. I am gonna go to sleep, and I'll be back here in a couple weeks with a fun new video. Bye.